And can you hear me and can you see me? And can you see the PowerPoint? What does it say? Okay. All right. I got you. Very good. Okay, folks. Well, as you can see, I'm not in Lubbock, or at least I'm not where you normally see me from. I had to come to my cabin in the mountains to do some mechanical work. So I'm lecturing to you from 9,000 feet of elevation. And that's kind of the way it is. The next 3 lectures.
Flex.
The next 3 lectures are all on World War II. And you might ask yourself, why do I need 3 lectures on World War II? Well, let me tell you a little bit about the situation in our history department at Texas Tech. I teach a course called U.S. Involvement in World War II. That's a 16-week course. I have a colleague who teaches a course called Nazi Germany. I have another colleague who teaches a course called World War II in Europe. In other words, we have 3 courses, the equivalency of almost a year of courses on World War II. I also teach a graduate course called Studies in World War II. So the reason for this is that I argue, and I think most of my colleagues would argue, that World War II is the absolute most important event in the history of the world. There is nothing more important. There is nothing that impacted more people than World War II. Let me give you the number. 50 million people dead. 50 million people in virtually all of the continents of the world. So we consider it to be the event, not just of the 20th century, but of all of U.S. and world history. So I spend a lot of time on it. Some of you may have learned a lot about World War II from watching Hollywood films, and that's fine. Lots of movies about it, a lot of good movies about it, and some not so good. In fact, I'm teaching a course this summer. I normally teach a course in the summertime called the Vietnam War through film. This year, I've actually changed that course. It's a summer 1 course, and I've actually changed it, and it's called War Cinema, in which case I deal with a lot of different wars, but particularly I deal a lot with World War II. So I consider it to be very important, and I hope that you will understand why I spend 3 lectures on it. So your next exam will have the Modern Times lecture of a couple of weeks ago. We'll have this last Tuesday's lecture of the Depression, and today's lecture, number 1 on World War II, next Tuesday, number 2, and the following Thursday, number 3. So there's 3 big lectures on World War II. I will also be sending you some links, because if you were in my class today in Holden Hall 104, I would start out, I would walk into the classroom, and I would not even start talking without turning the screen on. And I would show you a clip, about a 9-minute clip that is from the movie called Saving Private Ryan. I do that because I want students to understand the impact of that war on men. D-Day, that's what it's about. So I will send you a link and you can watch it on YouTube, and I will warn you ahead of time if you have not seen that movie, or if you're people that are squeamish and things, war cinema bothers you, then you should probably be careful about watching it. But I'm also going to send you another link of a movie that I'll talk about a little bit today about Adolf Hitler. So this war, this event, is so big that I think it requires us to deal with it in this way. Now, I'm also going to caution you that when I lecture on World War II, it may seem to you that I jump around a lot, that I don't follow anything just completely chronological. And the reason for that is that I want you to experience what it must have been like for someone like Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, or Winston Churchill from England, or Joseph Stalin from the Soviet Union, or even, we can even argue Benito Mussolini, or we can even argue Adolf Hitler. What it was like for all of these guys to be sort of in charge of something that was so big that every single day you had to deal with something else in some other place. In other words, this is not easy to get our arms around. So I take the position that since it's not easy to get our arms around, I won't get my arms around it easily. I will talk about it as it comes. So as you're taking your notes, if you have questions, signify questions, you can stay. When we do the Q&A, you can ask me questions. You can even follow up with questions to me by email on the content of the lecture or to your TAs, because it's big, it's huge, it's very, very important. So I'm going to be setting the tone today. I'm not sure if I'll get all the way to the U.S. Being involved in World War II, but you need to understand everything that happens up to this time so that we can understand how the hell did all of this stuff happen. So I'm going to go to a screen here to kind of give you an idea of what I'll be talking about. Let me see if I got it all there. There we go. I'm going to be talking about the interwar period, meaning between World War I and World War II. What were the things that happened that caused the U.S. to be involved in this war? I'm going to talk a lot about Adolf Hitler today. I'm going to talk about what I consider to be the first moment of the war, which is different than most historians. I consider World War II to have begun way back in 1931, not in 1939, and you'll understand that when I get to that point. I'm going to talk about the Holocaust, which I consider to be the second war, Hitler's war against the Jews. I'm going to talk about his conquering of Europe, and then I'll talk about bringing the United States into it. First of all, I want you to appreciate what I consider to be the causes of World War II. I'm going to give you actually 5 different things that what I consider to be causes, not triggering events, but causes themselves. So the first one is the Treaty of Versailles that we talked about at the end of World War I. The Treaty of Versailles, there were several things that happened at that treaty that, in my opinion, caused everything else that happens. At Versailles, there was what we call the War Guilt Clause. The War Guilt Clause. It's actually Article 231. And in Article 231, Germany was blamed for World War I. And they were required to pay reparations of $32 billion. $32 billion, which is probably about $600 billion today. And that threatened to destabilize completely Germany. And in the destabilization of Germany, we will see, of course, the rise of Adolf Hitler, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I think Versailles and what happened at Versailles is one of those causes. The second cause that I blame as a reason for World War II is America becoming an isolationist nation. We became an isolationist nation. We demobilized our military. We said, never again do we want to do this. We don't want, and as a result of that, we sort of said, no more war, America. We don't want to be involved in any of these things again. And as a result of that, we didn't create a Department of Defense. That won't happen until after World War II. We actually will try to set up a sort of an anti-war theory of war that I'll be talking about in a few minutes, where we actually will sign some treaties. So that's going to happen. So America's isolationist period is the second cause. The third cause is the rise of Japan as a military power. Because what happens when Germany loses the war in World War I, they give up several places in the Pacific. They give up the Carolinas, the Marianas, and the Marshall Islands. France is a bankrupt country, so they have problems holding on to their imperialist places in the Pacific, like French Indochina, Vietnam. And so because of that, there's a desire on the part of Japan to step into the void that is caused by Germany being defeated. So that's a third cause, the rise of Japan as a military power. The fourth cause that I believe is important is technological considerations, particularly the consideration of airplanes. I'm going to give you a name now and a book that I want you to write down. And the man's name is Julio, Julio, Julio Douhet, and that is spelled Douhet, Julio Douhet, and he is Italian. Douhet writes a book in 1922, and the book is called Command of the Air. Command of the Air. Now, we talked about this guy, Mahan, who had written this book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, being so important when it came to navies. Well, Douhet's book is important because of the way he looks at air power. Douhet essentially says in his book that the country that owns the airspace above cities and above countries can win any war that they choose by demanding that those who they are about to bomb succumb or sue for peace, because we are going to kill your civilians. Our goal is to kill your civilians in your country, which means the leaders will always have to be concerned not just about the land, not just about the sea, but the air above them. And why that's important is that airplanes themselves are still pretty much those things that we talked about in World War I, those airplanes that don't have any ability to drop bombs and do all those things that are important in war. That will happen, though. So I'll be talking about that here in a few minutes. And then finally, as the fifth reason or cause of World War II, and this will seem somewhat crazy to you, and somewhat people would even argue that I'm wrong, but I call it the rise of bad people. The rise of bad people. Well, y'all know who I'm talking about here. Adolf Hitler was a special kind of person. Thank goodness the world hasn't seen very many Adolf Hitlers, but the world saw an Adolf Hitler during this time. Some would argue that you could make the same case about some of the leaders of Japan, Emperor Hirohito. I don't particularly put Hirohito in the same category as Adolf Hitler. Some would, I don't. But some of the ways that Japan decided to fight the war are terrible ways of fighting and break every rule of moral authority, every rule of moral ethics that you can imagine. So I argue that that is a fifth reason. So those are the 5 reasons for what I consider to be so very important. So let me talk about some of these things now in more detail. The interwar period saw the United States of America decide to push for de-armament, to push for a resolution of getting rid of the arms race that we had seen cause World War I. You remember we talked about the lethality of artillery and lethality of machine guns and all those things. Well, this is still going to be the case. But now we're going to say, you know, where we've got to solve the problem is on the seas. We've got to come up with a way to restrict the size of ships. So at the Washington Naval Conference that America organized, we invited members of the world to come in and negotiate treaties. Now, I don't want you to worry about the 9-power theory, the 9-power treaty. Concentrate only on the 5-power treaty. And you don't have to memorize these tonnages. But essentially what the 5-power treaty said was that the United States of America, being the largest with the most coastline, and Britain with the most coastline, will be restricted to a navy that only has as its navy 525,000 tons of ships. Japan would have 315,000, and France and Italy 170, and France and Italy each 170,000 tons. The idea was if we can keep these navies small, we don't have to worry about those huge ships that caused all that problem in World War I. So these ships will be defensive. And the way that the treaty was set up is that they would defend our coastlines. Big countries get the most, but smaller countries get less. But the idea is you can't build a big navy. Now, you see here, Germany's not included. And the reason Germany's not included is because we said in the Treaty of Versailles, you can't even have an army. You can't have an army, can't have a navy. All you can have, Germany, is a few soldiers, and we're going to call them the National Police Force, just to defend yourselves. You can't otherwise have a military because you caused World War I. That was the argument. So Germany's a little pissed. They're not at the table, of course, when all this happens. But the truth of the matter is it's part of the reason. So the 5-power treaty does essentially that. Now, let me tell you about an event that takes place that gives us an idea of what it must have been like for these countries to disarm. I have a picture up here of a ship. It's a German battleship called the Ostfriesland. The Ostfriesland. And the United States of America, there was a person in the United States military. He was in the Army. Write his name down. His name is Billy Mitchell. Billy Mitchell, Mitchell. If any of you are from Wisconsin, you know that there's an airport. Their main airport in Milwaukee is named the Billy Mitchell Airport. Billy Mitchell is a very famous person that we can call the father of military aviation. The father of military aviation. He was actually a veteran of the Spanish-American War. He'd been in the Signal Corps. And as you remember, I told you that airplanes were actually part of the Signal Corps in the Army because Billy Mitchell learned to fly an airplane virtually on his own without much training. the bombing of the Ostfriesland is important. We saw a battle go on between the United States Navy and the United States Army for who would control the air. The Navy said, we don't believe that airplanes are very important. We think ships are the future of warfare. And all of the budget considerations that came down from Washington put big money in the Navy and hardly any money in the Army Air Corps. And the reason for that is because ships cost a lot more money than airplanes. And ships cost a lot more money if you think that airplanes are not going to be efficient enough to help you win a war. So the plan was, and it was put together by Billy Mitchell, the plan was that Billy Mitchell would fly some airplanes over this big ship called the Ostfriesland and drop bombs on this ship. It would be anchored, it wouldn't be moving, it would be anchored, and it'd be old because it's an old World War I battleship. But the Navy said, we don't think you can make a bomb big enough that could be picked up in an airplane and dropped on a ship. If you can convince us of that, maybe we'll think that the airplanes are important. So Billy Mitchell had this big old battleship towed out to Chesapeake Bay, actually a place called Cape Henry, which is kind of an estuary into Chesapeake Bay. And they flew over and dropped bombs on this ship. And a lot of them missed. A lot of them were too small. But finally, he got a bomb that was about 2,000 pounds and dropped that on the ship, and it missed, but it caused some concussion underneath, and essentially the Ostfriesland was sunk. Now, when I make the argument that this is one of the most important events leading up to World War II, people say, well, what's that got to do with anything? Well, the Navy still objected to thinking that airplanes were important. From the Navy's perspective, they said, well, if you come back to us with an airplane that can not only destroy a ship, but that can take off and land on a ship, well, you may have something there. We might be interested in something like that. Well, it'll take a few years for that to happen. However, there is someone else watching this event, and his name is Yamamoto. And some of you that know anything about this war will know that he becomes the man that is essentially responsible for bombing America into the war at Pearl Harbor. He's actually a graduate student at Harvard at the time. And he's watching. And it will be Japan that will pick up on the idea of airplanes taking off and landing from a ship. But this event is very important because it shows that America still is kind of isolationist. We don't spend a lot of money building airplanes with the idea that they're going to be used in warfare. We don't buy into Julio Duhay's argument that the country that controls the air will control war. It's a problem. So that's the Ostfriesland. Now, let me run through these a little bit quickly here. Here is a depression soup kitchen. I showed you these pictures the other day. Bottom line is that the United States of America is in a depression, but our depression isn't as bad as the depression that is taking place in the rest of the world. So let's move on to Europe. Let me talk about this guy. And of course, his name is Adolf Hitler. I've got a screen up here to show you the things that I will be talking to you about. Hitler is one of the most important but complicated figures in world history. Excuse me. Adolf Hitler was, as you know from my lecture on World War I, was a veteran of World War I and was awarded the Iron Cross. He was a pretty good corporal, but don't anyone ever try to make the case to me that he was a good general, because he was a horrible general, and you'll hear me talk about that over the next few days. Adolf Hitler was born in Austria. He was not even German. He was Austrian. But he believed that Austria should have been part of Germany. Therefore, he considered himself to be someone who should be allowed to lead Germany. He will start a party called the National Socialist Defense Party. For your purposes, all you have to do is know that it became known as the Nazis. And this is in 1921, so it's just a few years after World War I ends. And in a place in Berlin there will, at a beer hall actually, there will be an event take place where Hitler tries to create a coup to take over the German government. He will be brought to trial and he will be sentenced to 5 years in prison. He will go to prison, and while in prison, he will write a book. And let's see, I think I had that up there. Yeah, he'll write this book. It's called Mein Kampf. He doesn't actually write it. People say he actually sat down and wrote it. He actually dictated it to another guy, a guy by the name of Rudolf Hess. But Hitler is a very confusing guy, because he writes in this book, Mein Kampf, his tremendous hatred for Jews. We don't know for sure why he hated Jews so much. All kinds of theories. One of the theories is that he hated Jews because his mother had died of breast cancer, and that one of the doctors that worked on her was Jewish. We don't think that's true, though, because we have a record that shows that he wrote a thank you note to the doctor for trying to save his mom's life. So we don't think it's that. Another theory is that he had applied for art school in Venice and had been turned down. He was somewhat of a sculptor, somewhat of a painter, wasn't very good at either one of them. And the committee that admitted people to the university turned him down. And supposedly there may have been some Jews on that committee. We don't know for sure what caused this tremendous hatred for Jews, but he writes about it in Mein Kampf. And while I don't necessarily think you ought to go out and buy the book and read it and see what he says, I do teach that book in my graduate courses. And I always tell my students to please buy the book on Amazon, because I refuse to order the book so that it sits in the bookstore at Texas Tech with Mein Kampf, and then underneath it, it says Ron Milam, PhD. I don't want to be associated with that. But it is important for us to understand this guy. And one of my frustrations is there were other people in the United States military and in the United States State Department that should have read Mein Kampf, because it was actually published in 1932, 1933. So we should have known about this guy, but somehow or other we didn't. I've got a picture on the screen of a movie called Triumph of the Will. Triumph of the Will, and the producer director is a woman by the name of Leni Riefenstahl. Write her name down, please. Leni Riefenstahl. She's a great filmmaker. And the movie Triumph of the Will, as bad as the content is, it's a great made movie in terms of its cinematography and everything about it. I will send you a link for some parts of it that I want you to watch. I would normally show this in the classroom because it's important for you to see it. So anyway, Hitler is then, so he then comes out of prison. He writes, he runs for office. He is appointed as a minister, and eventually he will be named chancellor. Yeah, here's a picture of him in the movie Triumph of the Will. Here he is, there he is, Chancellor Hitler. An incredibly charismatic man. Incredibly charismatic. But I also argue a terrible person in all respects. All right, so I'm going to switch gears again, and we're going to go to the Pacific. In 1931, see if I got a map here. In 1931, Japan is going to invade a part of China called Manchuria. 1931. Now, this is at least 6 to 7 years before most historians agree or want to say that the World War II starts. Most people will say it starts when Germany invades Poland, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But I want to talk about 1931. The province of Manchuria had mineral resources that were associated with, that were things that Japan would like to have had. Now you can see where Japan is here, and you can see where China is, and we can certainly make the argument that it's close. And Japan had built a railroad through Manchuria to haul mineral resources to the edge where Japan would purchase them from Japan, but from China. But Japan actually owned the railroad. Well, there is a terrorist incident that takes place, and some argue that Japan actually caused the terrorist action to take place to disable their own railroad, so it would give them an excuse to invade Manchuria. Historians have gone back and forth with that one. Bottom line is Japan decides to invade the province of Manchuria and to give notice to China that Japan is the big boy on the block and that they should always fear Japan. Now, this is 1931. A few years later, in what many will consider, and I am one of those, will consider to be an event that is almost, that except for the numbers, is almost as bad as the Holocaust itself. Japan is going to invade China. And they're going to invade China, and I'm going to show you a couple of pictures that are kind of hard to watch. This one is their invasion of the capital of China, the capital being at that time Nanking. This is a picture of Japanese soldiers using live Chinese POWs, Chinese soldiers, as live bayonet practice. Japan will invade Nanking, take over the capital in 1936 and 1937. And it is a signal to China that Japan is going to be there and is going to ultimately control the most populated country of the world. And here's one more terrible picture of the steps of the capital of Nanking with bodies of women and children. Now the title, the name rape, is given to was given to the event because Japanese soldiers committed such amazing atrocities against the Chinese people. Such things as raping women and children, causing tremendous destruction of the people and the feelings that they had about life. It's a terrible event. I teach about it in my graduate courses, but at least I want to mention it to you. For many of you, you will have never heard of the rape of Nanking because we don't teach much about it. But at the same time, it's important to understand that this is sort of the beginning of the war in the Pacific, and we're going to see that become even bigger as the war moves to that part of the world. Let me go back to Europe. In 1935, the Congress of Germany, the Reichstag, will pass a series of laws proposed by Adolf Hitler. Those laws are called the Nuremberg Laws. The Nuremberg Laws essentially said to German Jews, you are not important in the future of Germany, and we're going to restrict you to these things. If you are a professor at a German university, you are Jewish, you are fired. If you are a doctor, you can only have non-Jew patients. If you are a Jew who is wealthy and owns banks and runs banks, you will give up those businesses. If you are a German family, you can have a Jew as your servant, but if you are Jewish, you cannot have a Jew as your servant. And if you are German, you cannot marry a Jew. If you are a German, you cannot have a Jewish boyfriend or girlfriend. And if it is found out that you have had sexual intercourse with a Jew and you are German, then you are in big time trouble, as is your boyfriend or girlfriend. Now, there are many more things about the Nuremberg laws that we need to know about. But for the purposes of this course, it is the first time that Jews recognize that they need to leave. They need to get out of Germany. And when we talk about the Holocaust, as I will be doing today and over the next 2 days, lectures, some parts of it, we also, when we talk about the 6 to 7 million Jews who become victims of the Holocaust, the smallest number among the large countries of Germany, of Europe, are Germans. The Jews, many Jews in Germany saw this as a reason to leave. They tried to go wherever they could be, wherever they could immigrate to, including the United States. And quite frankly, I will argue that the United States was not very welcoming. We had a lot of anti-Semitic people in America, including people like Henry Ford that we talked about before. The United States government was not very, did not allow immigration to very many. Albert Einstein being one of the few. People that we thought could bring something to our country rather than just immigration. If you couldn't bring anything in and you were Jewish, bring something in, meaning talents of some way or wealth, then we pretty much didn't care about you immigrating to our country. Not a very much of a thing to be proud of. In 1938, in what we call Kristallnacht. And of course, Kristallnacht means night of broken glass. Jewish synagogues throughout Germany were burned to the ground. This is a map of all of the places that we saw synagogues burned to the ground. Here's a picture of one of the synagogues burning. And of course, what we know is that, again, this is another signal. This is 1938. What we know happens then is Germany will create concentration camps. Now, they will eventually create death camps. But in the beginning, the concentration camps are to place Jews in the camps, men, women, and children. And for those who can do work that aids their military efforts, they stay alive. Those that cannot are executed. And I'll be talking more about that next time. But Hitler is ready to conquer Europe. And he's going to do this in a methodical way. And the first thing that I want to talk about is the Munich Pact. I'll put a picture of that up here. Munich Pact. This is in 1938. It's right within a few days, actually, of the Kristallnacht. The area around Czechoslovakia, and for those of you who don't know about that term, today that's called the Czech Republic. Parts of it are called the Czech Republic. But my great grandmother was from there. The area around Czechoslovakia is called Sudetenland. You can see it in brown on this map. Sudetenland bordered Germany, and Hitler made the case that the Sudetenland should have been Germany, and that most of the people around there spoke German, and that they had a strong desire to be German. And so Hitler will meet with the leaders of Europe. And those leaders of Europe will include such people as England, Germany. Germany will lead it. It will also include Italy. It will also include most of the countries, France, from Europe. And Hitler says, all I want is the Sudetenland. If the German leaders will give me the Sudetenland, that's all I want. There's the Prime Minister of England is a man by the name of Neville Chamberlain, Chamber, Chamberlain, Neville Chamberlain. He will actually say and go home to England and say, I believe Hitler. I believe Hitler when he says that he has no desire on the rest of Europe. He only has desire on the Sudetenland. Peace in our times. Well, the Munich Pact becomes an example that will be used for the next 80 to 90 years by leaders of countries to say appeasement doesn't work. When you try to believe bad leaders when they say things, this will happen. Will you, Bush 41 will actually use it about Saddam Hussein. I believe President Lyndon Johnson will use it about Ho Chi Minh. We'll use it about Mao Zedong. We'll use it about Fidel Castro in Cuba. It's kind of becomes the issue. Munich Pact never works. Appeasement never works. 1 year later, almost exactly 1 year later, Hitler will invade Poland. Hitler will invade Poland. Now let's think about this. I got a map here of Poland, got a map of where Poland lies in relationship to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. You know that is Russia today. You see where Germany is on the map. Germany will invade Poland. And at the same time Germany invades Poland, they sign what's called a non-aggression pact with Russia, with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union makes really good tanks, and Germany will sign an agreement to buy tanks from the Soviet Union. But in between there is Poland, and that's where they have invaded. Most historians say this is the beginning, September of 1939. 1 year later, Hitler will begin the assault on England from the air. Going back to what I talked about with Julio Duhay's book, he who controls the air controls the war. And what will they bomb? Everything. They will bomb everything. The goal is to kill as many civilians as you possibly can. When you can kill non-combatants, women and children, that will cause leaders to sue for peace, to say we can't handle this. The British do handle it. The British do handle it well. The British actually go into tunnels and survive. At the same time all of this is happening, the British have decided that they don't need Neville Chamberlain anymore as their prime minister, because he had done such a bad job of reading Hitler's intentions at Munich. They will replace him with a guy by the name of Winston Churchill. And I'll be talking more about him next time. So we've got Germany. They have also invaded France, set up their own government in France. So they now control France. They're not controlling Britain. Britain hasn't fallen. And Britain comes to the United States and asks for our help. Now, here I am by 1940. We know Hitler came into power in 1933-34, and the United States is still not involved in this war. Kind of like in World War I, the President Roosevelt has run for re-election in he ran in 32, was elected. He runs in 36, is re-elected. We see a war going, we see these bad things happening in Europe. He's watching. And in 1940, he runs for re-election, and he says the same things Wilson said. I will not send American boys to fight a war in Europe. We're staying out of this one. However, we have another idea. How about if we try to buy our way out of this war? So we do a deal with Winston Churchill. And the deal with Winston Churchill is that Britain can bring their ships to the United States of America. And we will repair those ships in our shipyards in places like Norfolk, Virginia. We'll allow them to repair their ships. We call this program the Lend-Lease program. Lend, L-E-N-D -lease, L-E-A-S-E. We are trying to buy our way out of this war by helping our friends in England. In addition to that, we will do one other thing. We will say, tell you what, Britain, we got some ships. We'll give you our ships. You use them in battle, and then when the war's over, give them back. Now, I use the example, it would be like telling somebody, here's a stick of gum, chew it, and when you're done with it, give it back to me. A chewed up piece of gum doesn't do you much good, nor does a beat up ship do you much good. But this is our deal, to keep us out of this war, to keep us from having to send American boys to Europe to fight what is considered to be a European war. We say we'll help our ally, Britain. Well, I told you about the non-aggression pact that Hitler signs with Stalin, the chairman of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, Russia, USSR. Well, Hitler decides that he's invaded all these other countries. So now, even though I have a non-aggression pact with Russia, I think I'll invade them anyway. And so in June of 1941, Hitler invades Russia. And he actually invades, he's already got Poland, controlling Poland, so he invades Russia through Poland. And as I told you that Russia had these really good, beautiful tanks. Tanks are being sent from Soviet Union to Germany as Germany's invading the Soviet Union. But that's when Hitler begins to be what I consider to be such a really, really bad general. Here's a picture of German soldiers about 60 miles away from Moscow. They get to within 60 miles of the capital of the Soviet Union. And this idiot, Hitler, has done some terrible things for his soldiers. First of all, he doesn't give them good cold weather gear. His theory is, if my soldiers think that they need to get home before winter, Russian winters being so hard compared to some of the German winters, particularly the southern, down south further. If he thinks that the soldiers will fight harder if they don't have good clothing. He even goes so far, he doesn't give them gloves. He even goes so far as to give the tankers, the armor units, the wrong viscosity of oil that will keep their tanks running properly in that kind of weather. It's not properly weatherized. Operation Barbarossa is almost Germany taking over Russia, but it falls just barely short, just barely short. And as a result of that, Russia maintains their strong military, and the Soviet Union, Russia, turns to England and turns to the United States and says, we have got to stop Hitler. We have got to stop Hitler. I'm not sure how we're going to do this, but we've got to stop Hitler. With that, I'm going to stop my lecture, even though I could go on and talk forever. But today, since I've already been talking an hour, and I know some of you may have some questions, I'm going to, I normally in this lecture bring the United States into it with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. But Pearl Harbor is so important that I'm going to leave that for the introduction of my lecture that I will give next Tuesday, because I know there's maybe some people that have some questions about what I went over in great detail. I'd be glad to answer any questions that you may have now.
Yes, I have a question.
That Claire.
What was the program that what was the name of the program that the U.S. would do to help fix the ships again for Britain?
It's called Lend-Lease. There's actually a big fancy name for it. I won't give you that. It had passed by Congress. For your purposes, just call it the Lend-Lease program. And I like to sort of use the term buy our way out, because that way we're still sort of helping, but we're not risking the lives of our American soldiers. Because Tuesday, when I talk about Pearl Harbor, that's when the United States actually gets involved. We're not involved, and this thing's been going on in Europe and actually in Asia too, because of what happened with Japan's invasion of China. Lots going on, but we're going to just buy our way out, and we'll help out in any way. Actually, the Lend-Lease program actually extends even almost to today, in the sense that Britain still owes us money, and now and then they write us a check for some of the stuff that we gave them back then.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Just
Anyone
a
else?
couple. Just a couple.
What we got here? Byron?
Yes, sir. When was the main Kemp book written, or who was it written by?
Mein Kampf. Mein
Mein
Kampf.
Kampf.
It was actually written in the mid-20s, but it was not published until 32. But it's written by Adolf Hitler, and yeah, and it's essentially my life, my struggle. Lots of ways to look at it. It is absolutely the worst thing that you can read. I mean, it really, he describes Jews as vermin. He actually says in his book, if we, and the really sad thing about this to me is that German Jews fought for Germany in World War I. I mean, they really did. The German Jews loved Germany. That was their country. But in this book, he actually uses phrases like, if we can send German boys to fight in war, we should be able to exterminate the vermin that are Jews. And he doesn't give a reason for that. I mean, he doesn't give a reason for his hatred, other than a lot of people blamed the Depression in Europe on Jews because they controlled many of the banks. Yeah. And therefore there was but it was a scapegoat situation.
Okay.
He saw them as scapegoat.
Do we need to know the name? Because you said he dictated a guy to write it for him.
Rudolf Hess. Now, the only reason I throw his name out is because Rudolf Hess is an interesting character. He becomes very important in the Nazis, with the Nazis. I can't remember if I talk about him later, but Rudolf Hess is actually he's one of the few big name time guys that isn't executed at the end of the war at Nuremberg. And as a result of that, they send him to prison for life. And so for the rest of his life, he's in prison, and he dies in prison, and he's the only prisoner. They keep a prison open just to keep Rudolf Hess in it. I think that's kind of unique.
Yeah, and that is interesting. And when was the non-aggression pact signed?
It was signed in 1930, in 1939, and 2 years later they invade.
Okay, thank you.
It's signed about the same time that Germany invades Poland, because you can see where the Soviet Union would be pretty concerned that their neighbor is actually now invaded and occupied by Germany, somebody they have a non-aggression pact with. Now, also, you're going to find in my lecture that I give on the Cold War, which is the lecture I give right after you have your next exam, we'll see that the reaction of the Soviet Union to America, who will become their ally, is we don't want to ever have another war like this. So we're going to make sure that our neighbors are our people, and they'll hold on to Poland for a long time.
Yeah, and last thing, do we need to know when the concentration camp started?
You may think this is strange, but I'm not a big date person. History for me is not about dates. Okay. It's about relationships. Okay. And I'm glad you asked that question, because what you're going to need to know more than actual dates that things happen is sequences of events and chronology. In
Okay.
other words, I'll be talking about certain things that happen in the war, and you need to know the events in the orders that they take place. And so as you listen to me talk, you can write down the dates, but I don't want you spending time memorizing dates, but I want you to know that the invasion of Poland happened after the Munich Pact. In other words, today I've talked about Munich Pact, I've talked about the Sudetenland, then I've talked about the invasion of the Battle of Britain, and you need to know how those sequences take place because each one of those things builds on the next thing. That's
Okay.
more important than dates.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Who else?
What was the
Colby.
Yes, sir. What was the group that Adolf created? The Social Party?
It's the National Socialist Party. Just think of it as National Socialist Party, and it's called the Nazis. Nazis.
Yes, sir. Thank you
That's
so
all
much.
you need to know it as. And let me throw this out, okay? Because I know you people are also smart, and you all pay attention to what's going on in the world. There are people that try to make the argument that America is becoming a socialist nation, and that's what happened with the Nazis. The Nazis aren't anything like most socialist countries, okay? Adolf Hitler was a special kind of guy, and you can't compare him to anything that's happening, anything else in the world, or certainly anything that's not happening in America. So don't buy any of that that stuff.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Anything else?
Well, I had a question.
Yeah, Kayla.
What was the command of the air about again?
Well, this guy, Julio Duhay, wrote a book in 1922 in which he said, it's called Command of the Air. And he said, if you can control the air above a city where there's lots of inhabitants and you can threaten or drop bombs on the suburbs or drop bombs on, then you can win wars that way. Because leaders would never want their women and children, their non-combatants, to die. And everybody pretty much in the world bought into that idea except America. We sort of said, no, we're still about ships. We're still about guys with guns on the ground. We don't believe in air. And if you read some of the budget discussions that went on in Congress trying to get money to build airplanes, it was like, no, we already have a couple of those. We don't need them. And part of that was because of the Navy's reluctance to give this kind of authority to the Army. Because the Army, as I talk about World War II, I won't be talking about the Air Force. There is no Air Force. There is an Army Air Corps, and there's a Navy. The Navy, I always make this argument. Many of you that are Navy people, apologize to you too. The Navy people want their own everything. The Navy has its ships. The Navy has its infantry. They're called Marines. And the Navy now has its airplanes. And they have airplanes, and they'll keep airplanes once they figure out how to take off and land on one. And that becomes, of course, the aircraft carrier. But Japan beats us to that. Anyone else?
Oh, I had a question.
Joshua.
Didn't Operation Barbarossa inspire like a military strategy, kind of like Scorched Earth?
You mean a military strategy by Germany?
No, just in general, kind of like they failed because of the cold, right?
Well, they failed because of the cold, and they failed because of poor leadership. And that's what I blame on Hitler, thinking that you can motivate soldiers by denying them the ability to do their job. And that was what his thinking was.
Okay.
You might be thinking of another term that I didn't throw out because I don't test on it. It's called blitzkrieg. And
yes, blitzkrieg, that's what it was.
Okay. Well, good point. Well, blitzkrieg is actually a term that a reporter from Time magazine gave to the operation when Germany invades France. I didn't talk about that because the invasion of France just takes a couple of weeks. And France essentially sits out World War II because of that. But remember, I talked about France in World War I. France lost virtually its whole generation of soldiers. They're not ready to fight. They're not ready. But Germany invades France and takes it over and that sort of thing. Take my World War II class sometime and I'll teach you more about that.
All right, thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. Anything else?
I have one small question.
Yes, Audrey. Bree, excuse me.
Earlier you were talking about whenever the Pacific was starting to being taken over by Japan. You mentioned that France had two places, Vietnam and somewhere else I missed.
Well, I actually, the best way to call it, I think I said Vietnam. I may have said Laos and Cambodia. It was called French Indochina, and it included Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And I'll talk at great length about that later on. But Japan is wanting the Chinese, the largest country in the world, they're wanting them to see the military power that Japan has. And next Tuesday, when they invade America, when they bomb Pearl Harbor, that will become the big issue, is how they deal with Japan, how Japan deals with Asia, and how the United States decides to respond to Japan's wanting to control Asia. We are going to, remember I talked about it a couple of weeks ago, I talked about the Chinese exclusion law of 1882. The United States is still keeping Chinese out of America. And now we're going to become their ally in their fight against Japan. Anything else?
Yes, sir.
Taylor.
Yes, sir. So just to make sure, so Crystal that's when the synagogues were burned down, and then that's when all the concentration camps started and death camps started, right?
Yeah, I use Kristallnacht as sort of the beginning of that. There were certainly discussions within the German government, Hitler's government, about building those concentration camps and things. Kristallnacht is when the Jews themselves realize how bad things really are. And that's what starts them having to wear the identifications on their clothes that they are Jewish and all of those kinds of things. Kristallnacht is one of those defining moments. And it takes place on, November 9 and 10. We say one night, but, it starts at 11 o'clock at night and runs until 3 in the morning. So we say it's over that period. But it's also, the other thing that always bothers me is it's September of, it's November 9th and 10th. So it's just a few days after the Munich Pact is signed. And that's when people start saying, whoa, this guy Hitler's pretty serious about what's going on. We better get out of here. And that's where German Jews start to try to leave the country and go other places, either into other German countries. A lot of them go to Poland. Poland will have more Jewish people executed than Germany. And a lot of them go to Italy, some go to England, some of them try to come to America. Yeah. Anything else?
If nobody else.
Kevin, you down there, Kevin?
Yeah. A few questions, and then would it be all right if so I told you before I'm really into Navy stuff. Would it be all right if I make one or two comments? Because I know for Pearl Harbor, I think it would help the class to have a.
Yeah, well, let's not talk about Pearl Harbor till I talk about it first, okay?
So one question. So you mentioned those naval treaties. We'll just need to know the 5 treaty, the 5 nation thing with the Washington Naval Treaty.
Yeah. I put that up there only because, well, first of all, it's a failed attempt, okay? And it to me, it identifies the importance of the isolationist period. The United States actually thought that we could keep these wars from happening by having a reduction in the arms race. And the arms race at that time, it wasn't airplanes yet, because there's no airplanes, wasn't nuclear, which will come in a few years. It wasn't land warfare, it was ships. And they thought that we could do that. And I see that as sort of a non-intellectual understanding of warfare, because you could see that air power was going to become dominant. Now, I'm also a believer that air doesn't win wars. Okay, and you'll get that from me over the next 8 weeks. But at the same time, the Luftwaffe that Germany creates and then bombs the hell out of Britain for that long period of time of the Battle of Britain is really important. It pretty much almost gets, if the United States doesn't come in, I'm not sure that England doesn't fall. And of course, there's a planned invasion, a ground invasion.
Wasn't that Operation Sea Lion, wasn't it?
No, it was actually Operation, let me think a minute. It's not Fortitude. It's Fortitude comes later. I'll give it to you. Ask this question again on Tuesday.
All right.
I got too many operations in my mind. I just got done before I get you guys. I teach a course called The History of Small Wars. And I did Operation Just Cause in Panama today. So I'm up to my ears in operations. So
one last quick question.
Yeah.
What's like the requirements for your World War II history course? Because World War II history is one of my favorite things, and I'm interested in that.
What I strongly suggest you do, we offer 3 of them. Nazi Germany by Dr. Rick Lugens, who's really good. And then we teach a course called U.S. Involvement in World War II. And I'm not sure who's teaching that now. We hired a new woman that's pretty good. And then I don't get to teach it very often because I have to teach Vietnam every other year. So I only offer it about every 3 years. But it's a good course. Yeah.
All right. Is there anything that might be more Navy focused, or is that kind of more get towards graduate courses?
No, I teach a course called History of U.S. Sea Power. Don't teach it very often because I'm not a Navy guy, but we do teach it at the graduate level sometimes.
All right. Well, thanks.
Yep. Anything else? Well, you've been a good audience today. I do appreciate it. This is one of those subjects that I sort of get fired up about, and so that's why I do 3 of them. And since I've only got a few of you here, I will just say this. You should have received your examination grades, and I strongly urge you to discuss any issues. Our goal is to make sure you do well in the class. And in talking to my TAs and looking at the grades and everything, I was satisfied that the examination was, well, first of all, from my perspective, the most important thing is that the examination is fair. And by that, I mean that it's almost a bell curve. The average grade was 14.76, as I recall, which is about 74%. And so that means that we designed an examination that was essentially the class average was a C. However, we also had a whole lot of really good A's and really strong A's. We had more F's and D's than I would ever want. And so I will repeat again that our goal is to make sure you do well on the exams. Therefore, you do well in the course. You have an essay that you're going to be writing that is a good way to make up for it and for your grade. And also the extra credit that I have identified with the films gives you a chance to add up to 4 percentage points. So what that means is that, let's say you got a 14, and that's a C minus, I guess, 14. If you did 2 extra credit things and got 4 extra points, then theoretically your C is now an A. Now we don't use it till the very end. We add it to the whole thing at the end. But as I said in my very first day, you get 88% in this class, and that's a B plus. And you do 4 extra credits, you get 4 extra credit points, and that's a 92. And so you just went from a B to an A. So I strongly urge you to either talk to me or talk to your TAs about extra credit. It's identified in your syllabus as to what those films are, how you do it. And we don't believe that anyone has dug themselves into such a hole that they can't get themselves out of it. And we'll help you in any way that we possibly can to make sure that you're able to do that. Okay? Cool. Well, listen, all of you have a great weekend. And I will see you again on Tuesday, and we will talk about a day that will live in infamy. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Looking forward
Thank
to it,
you.
sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.